Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from the Western Cape pod bunker located here in the heart of Cape Town, South Africa. This pod is presented to provide a platform and a voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It is dedicated to those individuals and community groups that are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. In July, after 4 months of lockdown here in South Africa, the podcast ran a survey to canvass opinion and feedback from planners across the country, across the public, private and research sectors, and across the generations, both young and old. The survey ran for 2 weeks and sought to get responses and views on a whole range of topics affecting the planning industry. It was inspired by the social media debate that has been very evident online, and many professionals, young and old, had been sharing perspectives on hopes and fears, both online and now through the survey. You'll recall in our last episode where we spoke to the Royal Town Planning Institute, President Sue Mans, she talked about their ambition as a planning profession in setting a course for recovery and value add there in the UK. Here, through the survey, we were asking questions about value for money of organisations, important issues to the planning fraternity, employment status, engagement with the organisations, communication and value for money. And what is our value proposition to the clients and communities that we serve as a professional body, as a collective? In this episode, we find out what has the response been from the survey and what more can be done. We've gathered 9 professionals from across the country to share their thoughts and reflections, not only on the report, but their own hopes for the future. Many of them represent different organisations or have represented different bodies in the last few years. How should we be having these conversations? What topics should we be covering? And what action should we be taking? As a final point, some listeners and survey respondents had been surprised that reviews of the Talking Transformation podcast episodes are eligible for continuous professional development points through SACPLAN. You can get 3 points for each episode reviewed, in essence free CPD points that don't require thousands of rand in attendance fees. And in fact, one of our colleagues has racked up a full 3 years worth of CPD points just using this method. How to go about this and how to submit is changing as from August the 1st, and I'll be putting out a special bulletin explaining this change in the coming week. So also watch this space in respect of the CPD change in submitting your reviews of the podcast episodes. Arguably, this is the most important episode that we've put out of the podcast in this last year. It's a diverse series of voices. It's not always coherent and on the same page. There are diversities of views and diversities of opinions and personalities, and that's exactly what the podcast was introduced to consider. It's a regret that you won't be hearing from SACPLAN tonight. For reasons best only known to themselves, they declined to take part in this discussion this evening. It's a long episode, so settle in and either nail it in one go or take it in over a couple of sessions. The conclusions are certainly worth the wait and worth listening to and hearing out towards the end of the episode. And I'm really encouraging listeners to take up the opportunity to respond to this episode using the Anchor Podcast Platform's voice messaging app. You can find it on the Anchor Podcast platform. There is a voice message application there. Send in your queries, send in your thoughts, and respond to what you've heard tonight. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? If you don't want to use that messaging platform, please do feel free to drop us a line on talkingtransformation101@gmail.com. You can also tweet us and find us on Twitter at talkingtransfo and the number 1. Enjoy the episode and please do contribute. So it's just gone 5 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon here in South Africa, and the times for the planning industry are increasingly challenged. We're seeing an increasing number of social media posts around the future of and the current challenges relating to the planning industry. And tonight's conversation is trying to get us a sense of what are the issues, what are the conversations we as the planning industry should be having. And tonight we've gathered 9 professionals from across the country to share their thoughts, their reflections on not only the report and the survey that we put out during the last week or so, but their own hopes for the future, their hopes as professionals, as participants, as people who are looking to the future of South Africa and wanting to contribute. And the question that we're asking them today is, what are the topics that we should be having? What are the conversations we should be having with people? And what's the action, the call to action at the end of this, to try and say, how do we progress forward as a united front? We've got representatives from Gauteng, we've got representatives from the Free State, from the Western Cape. We've got 3 provinces represented here. In the Western Cape, I'm joined by Jessica Katz. Jessica, how are you keeping today?
Fine, thanks. And thanks for inviting me.
Very welcome. Your main reason for being here this evening?
Well, I think I've always had an interest in activism, and throughout my profession, I have contained that link. I have mostly been involved with SAPI, both in the National and the Western Cape Board. Most recently, though, I did pull out of the board at the last conference. So I'm no longer national, but I'm still helping the Western Cape. And I think if I'm going to represent anyone in this group, it would be the mother dealing with lockdown, tweens, and all those challenges that it brings on top of anything else, which, planning has to consider in terms of considering different needs. I mean, even how we respond to this lockdown. You've got tweens, you've got toddlers, you've got mothers that, we have to support at some point. And it affects us all differently. But I think that is something that has been a definite challenge for me, extra to other things during lockdown.
Up in the Free State, up in Bloemfontein, we've got Stuart Denoon-Stevens. Stuart, how are you keeping this afternoon? What brings you here?
Keeping well, surviving the very cold Free State weather. What brings me here? I've done some research on issues relating to this as part of the South African Planning Education Research Project, which is quite a mouthful. 5 years ago, I was involved with the South African Association of Consulting Professional Planners, and about 10 years ago with SAPI Western Cape, and about 5 years ago also SAPI Free State. So I've also got no longer representing any of those organizations, but I've got an interest from the past in terms of activism, and also in my academic role. A key thing for us is making sure that we are producing planning graduates who understand industry and making sure that our teaching is relevant to industry. So kind of my old activist hats, my hat as a teacher and also my hat as a researcher is kind of what brings me to this call and its interest.
Up in Tshwane, Fanas Mafufa, the online petition organizer. Fanas, how are you keeping today? What's your story and how have you been keeping?
Thank you, Pete, for having me. I'm the petition organizer. And actually, the petition has awakened things that have been sleeping. Brings me up today here. I'm here at my personal capacity and also representing the Planning Protection Group. This is a group that was formed just a few days after the petition went up. My concern was the professional bodies and also the Planning Profession Act, which is 18 years old. I find the act not relevant with the current issues, and also I see the act not protecting town planners overall.
Up in also Tshwane Way, Tsepo Tsetsetse.
I've been keeping well. I've been masking up, sanitizing, and social distancing. I think that's the most important message you should be calling out, particularly in this crisis that we are facing at the moment. And Pete, I'm here not only as a planning graduate, but also as a graduate representing many other graduates in South Africa who rather have lost hope in what they've been doing for the past few years or so. And I'm also here as part of the efforts to include young people, particularly around the issues of transformation, particularly in the planning fraternity, to hear the voice from the other side and to hear the message going forward to engage with the chaps that have been in the industry for a very long time.
In Cape Town, we have Mark Job. Mark, how are you keeping today? What's the story and what brings you here this afternoon?
Thanks, Pete. All good and well down here. Weather's a bit better. So we've got some sunshine and can get up the mountain. What do? I run a small practice, private sector, about 4 planners, and we've always had this view. I've always had this view that there are planning debates that span both the private sector and public sector fraternities. And previously I used to be involved with and still a member of the consulting planners, but I thought that an organization like SAPI is ideally suited to perhaps take on those debates that spans public and private sectors. For my sins, I am the Western Cape chairperson of SAPI, but in this conversation, I'm wearing my private hat. I haven't canvassed our membership to really take a position on things at this stage, and hence coming at this in my personal capacity.
Up in Johannesburg, Nelly Lester. Nelly, how are you keeping? What brings you here today?
Thank you very much, team, and thank you, Pete, for organizing this. I'm here mainly because of reflections, and I'm reflecting on 25 years on of working from Cape Town to NGO sector as Plan Act to National Department to HDA, amongst others, and just looking at the landscape and wanting to get a sense of where we are as a profession and not to be silent when there are voices calling for action, but also in ways that we can assist in ensuring that planning as a profession actually doesn't get lost in the midst of all the other concerns that we are seeing, COVID included.
The elder statesman of the discussion, Peter Daycombe up in Pretoria. It really is a privilege to have you on the conversation, Peter. We've known each other for many, many years. It's been a long time since we've spoken, but thanks for spending some time with us this afternoon, Pete. What brings you here? How have you been keeping?
Hi to everybody, and again, thank you to Pete for arranging this. I think it's long overdue. These kind of discussions are very necessary. Thank you for that. Where am I? In Tshwane, Pretoria, in the private sector. That's where I earn my bread and butter, but I'm also here representing the South African Association of Consulting Professional Planners, the North Region. For those who don't know, the North Region is basically the Gauteng, Northwest, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, and the KZN provinces, and Free State. And then I'm also a serving member of SACPLAN, where I sit on the disciplinary committee and the rules committee. But I'm not here representing SACPLAN. I have no mandate for that. But that's just to complete the picture. Thank you.
And from the southern region of the South African Association of Consulting Planning Practitioners, we've got Cor van der Merwe. Cor, welcome, sir. How are you keeping? And tell us a bit about yourself and how we find you today.
Hi, Pete. Yeah, thanks also from my side. You and I think some of the other guys who had input in that report and so on, there's a lot of work that went into that. One can see that it's quite comprehensive and very insightful. So thanks for this opportunity, this platform, which I think is very useful and can be very constructively used to address those issues that were identified and coming out of the report or the survey. My representation is primarily as the recently elected, offered, if you like, chairman of the Association for Consulting Planners in the South Region. That's for representing the Western Cape, Northern Cape, and the Eastern Cape. When I took over from the previous chairman about a month ago, primarily as chairman of the association down here in the South, I was the vice chair of the same association for the previous year or so before taking up the chairmanship. I'm also a registered planner with SACPLAN, but not speaking on their behalf or so. And then finally, I'm also a private planner. Been doing this for the last 20 years or so. First in Namibia a little bit, and then mostly in Cape Town, working with local authority for a few years, and then in the private sector. So we are a fairly large firm, about 9 or so planners that deals with the city quite comprehensively on a day-to-day basis. So that's my involvement here.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Prashila Patel. Prashila, very much welcome. Whereabouts do we find you this afternoon and what brings you here?
I'm thankfully keeping well and healthy given the circumstances. So I am a private planning consultant at Headland Town Planners. We do a lot of work around the country, but are based in Cape Town. I'm also a committee member with the South African Association of Consulting Professional Planners, SACP South, under the CPD portfolio. So my interest in this discussion comes from being a committee member, as well as in my personal capacity, having evolved from being a graduate planner to a young private planning consultant in the last 5 years.
Many thanks to you, Priscilla. Many thanks to all 9 of you for making the time and the effort after work to come and share your thoughts, share your experiences, and try and, as I say, progress the debate further. Peter, I'm going to come to you. As I say, with all respect, the elder statesman of this group. You've been around in planning for many, many years. You've served both SACPLAN and the South African Association of Consulting Planning Practitioners in various guises over the years. So when you saw this survey, when you saw the results of it, and you were kind enough to share with your members, and I really appreciate that. What were some of the immediate take-home points from your side? What were the things that were reinforced that you knew, but this makes sense and it just reinforces the issue? And perhaps what surprised you?
Pete, as I wanted to say, I'm just a bit concerned about continued reference to elderly, but I'll leave it there and take you on over a beer in future.
Look forward to that.
Firstly, the survey was first of its kind in the South African context, as far as I'm concerned. I found it interesting, and it explored a number of fields of information, or responses rather, that we simply haven't tested in the past. The one thing that stands out for me, and it's a sad one, a reflection, is the fact that as a profession, we seem to be divided into a number of enclaves, and I'm not sure whether it's good for a fairly small profession in the South African context and where we are in history. I consider that there should be, an attempt to create a cohesive unit called the planning profession, and that seems not to be the case at the moment. So that's my overall reflection. I was pleased by some of the responses on behalf of the consulting profession. They seem to be fairly satisfied with what they get from our association. But those were my basic reflections up front. I'm a bit concerned about the divisiveness, if you like, of the narrative at the moment, and I would plead for all concerned to work together to unite again, if that's possible. And I've got some thoughts to share later on.
Fantastic, Pete. Appreciate that and look forward to hearing what those thoughts are. Cor, as the representative who is wearing a hat firmly this evening of the southern region, anything you'd like to either agree or disagree or that was different in your experience? The one thing that certainly did come out in the survey was that in terms of your communication, the private sector seemed to be doing something right there. You guys were miles ahead in terms of the responsiveness and the communications relative to other organizations mentioned.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's potentially the result of being almost closer to home or be closer to the ground and be more in touch with the members of the association, as opposed to SACPLAN, who is the more like a national overarching, if you like, body, and it's just potentially more difficult to get to your members on almost a personal level, if I can put it that way. I mean, it's easier when you have AGMs or a social event or a breakfast to see your members and you cement these personal relationships, because I mean, as everyone knows, it's not a huge profession, I think, like the engineers or nursing or whatever. So you mostly know a lot of the other planners in your city or your town anyway. So that's the one thing. I agree with Pete. It would be nice if there was more cohesiveness between the different associations. It seems that they're all kind of operating in silos and everyone's doing his own thing, and potentially here and there's a bit of a contact between them. I think what surprised me from one of the things from the survey, the findings, was the relatively large, and this goes up to almost 80%, 60 to 80% of most of the respondents said that they have no intention of becoming a member of registering. The number is very low for SACPLAN and it's fairly low for SAPI, but for the others, it's a fairly high number, and I think it's disconcerting for us who's in those positions, but also for the industry as a whole, that so many of the respondents have no desire basically to be, or intention to become a member. That's the one thing that I wanted to. And the other thing, which was also, if I say surprising, I probably also mean it shouldn't be surprising, is the reason that about 80%, 70% of the respondents indicated that job reservation is the reason, and it seems to be the most important reason why they join or register with these associations, which obviously in the COVID scenario, it makes sense. But even before COVID, I mean, the issue of job reservation has been on the cards and discussed for many, many years. And we are moving towards hopefully narrowing it down and getting more recognition for it, because it is a problem. But it's an interesting thing that came out that was such a high percentage of people saying that is the reason why they're joining these associations or not. And for another 20 or so percent, what is very important. So I think the job reservation and some of those comments that came out where people feel very unhappy with reason that you study for a number of years, you struggle to get work, and then a land surveyor or someone else comes in and just snap up the job and do it for much cheaper and potentially and sometimes for lesser quality work than that's been submitted then.
Job reservation, there we are. We're not even into the second input, and job reservation, as you say, very strong in the response that came out from the survey. Probably no surprise if you look at the social media, the various comments that have been going around. And Fanos, let's bring you in here because, you know, your online petition that went out, I think it was about 2 weeks before the survey went out. Job reservation was one of the issues that you had wanted to raise. And let's start with what was it you were trying to achieve with the petition? Who was it you were angling that commentary to? What sort of numbers did you get in terms of the feedback? And did you find on the back of the survey coming out sort of 2 or 3 weeks after, was there anything there that in hindsight, if you could do it again, would you have done anything different in terms of shaping the conversation and the petition?
To be honest, the reason what inspired me to put down the petition, it was just when I heard that my colleague was retrenched from where we are working. That sparked something in me that we've been seeing happening, to say town planning is not protected, the profession as a whole. So when I said the protection of town planning industry by the professional body in South Africa, I wanted a professional body like your SAACPP, your SACPLAN, SAPI, any of the organizations that are available to take a stand and represent town planners. And they must be, in the same sense, they must protect town planners. What happens that when I put up the petition, it was directed specifically for SACPLAN and SAPI. The reason for that was because the SACPLAN and SAPI are one professional bodies that have more members, and also SACPLAN is recognized nationally. So the aim of the petition was to say we must get the Planning Profession Act to be amended, because the act that was done in 2002, it cannot be addressing issues of 2020. It's just wrong. The next, if the Planning Protection Act is amended, therefore we are going to bring job reservation through that act. What do I mean by that? If we have 3 sets of planners that are selected in terms of the SACPLAN or recognized in SACPLAN, which is candidate, technical, and professional. What must then happen is that there must be work divided for each candidate, for each registration. So, for example, a candidate planner can only do certain work, like let's say your building land relaxation and consent uses. Then when you go to technical planner, then we say they can do your building, your consent uses, your building land relaxation, removal of restrictive conditions, and some other applications. Then when you go to a professional, a professional, then we give them a chance to do your township establishment and other applications. That is the other thing. So the other thing we wanted is for SACPLAN to be specifically with SACPLAN to be transparent when it comes to their finances. We want they must tell us what's happening with their finances, because now we're paying our fees, our registration professional fees every year, but we don't know what's happening to them. When I went under the site, I'm trying to see the students that they are funding, but they are not really so many. So with that in mind, so that is just some of the things that we wanted to address, Pete. So thank you. Some of the things that we look at. And also with the petition, we received 2,185 signatures. Thank you.
No, that's impressive, Thanos. Again, somebody who went out their way just to try and canvass opinion and get a response, and to get 2,000 people from, literally, I think it was no more than 2 or 3 weeks. Absolutely outstanding. Really, really well done. So, Mark, you had wanted to make a comment?
The first is on what I found surprising by your work and your report, and that was really that there needs to be, I think there's a misunderstanding between the roles and functions of mandatory organizations such as SACPLAN and in the voluntary organizations such as SAPI and the SAACPP. And I get the sense that from the responses that people don't often understand the two and the requirements that the law places on registration in terms of SACPLAN, for example. That was the first point. The second point is I don't think the conversation can only be about job reservation. I think it's important because I think we need to define what we do and how we do it. But I think for the planning fraternity, for planners to become more prominent and take a more prominent role in society, I think we need to be valuable and give back into society. So it can't just be a thing of job reservation. It must be our value to societal debates is A, B, and C.
Powerful point, Mark. I think that whole question of the relevance of what is our role and what is our offering to society in this time of massive disruption, that was probably the main driver of the survey, was to say, in amongst real issues like job, whether it's job reservation, whether it's employment, and Seppo, I'd like to hear from you just now about how you've been finding the job market there as a graduate. These were some of the issues which I thought were important, is what is our offering? We're here as 10 town planners, each with a burning desire to see something done. But it sometimes seemed to me that at times the conversation was somewhat one-dimensional. Next up, I think we had Stuart. You had wanted to give us a perspective. You can touch a bit on the work that you had done and the research that you've done up there in the Free State on some of these issues.
Sure. I'm also coming in a little bit as a devil's advocate with this. And I think the point that you and Mark were talking about our value to societal debates, I think is also what I'm going to touch on a bit. My reaction to the report was also similarly how prominent job reservation has become. Playing a little bit of a devil's advocate here is that we keep on arguing that job reservation is actually possible. And what we've seen from the debates right from 2010 to present is that there's firstly stiff resistance from other professionals. And more importantly, the Competition Commission is actually, in exemptions from other professionals who already have job reservation, has basically refused to give those exemptions. So a caution on my side, not so much just about job reservation, but the fact that job reservation, apart from a very limited form of job reservation, doesn't appear to be legally or technically kind of actually possible. But we still keep on talking about it as it is. And I'm quite concerned that this is kind of creating a lot of tension, because people are basically, it seems to be that if we don't achieve job reservation, then our professional organizations have failed. But it's unlikely that they're going to achieve it. So it's starting to create a bit of a block. And that's one of the things I'm quite concerned about. As you said, just also with our own research, one of the things we did is we did about 89 interviews with planners across the country, mostly working planners. And one of the questions we're looking at is the success and failure of planning reform in South Africa. And when we did this research, successes were kind of almost a bit limited. SPLUMEP was almost a unanimous kind of success, as people were highlighting. But a lot of the failures that we came across, and this is not all of them, but things like job reservation, capacity, political interference, for example, all seem to be outward issues. It was things that planners could not control, but there's also a limited focus on, and this is where the value proposition comes in, is the inward issues. What are we offering to society? What are we trying to do? And some of my own research into land use management beyond the SAPA project has really started to question how well are we doing planning in South Africa, especially land use management? What are better ways to do land use management? And that for me is quite important, is if we keep on focusing on the outward issues, things that we can't control, we're going to just keep on getting frustrated. So then we need to start asking these questions of what are the inward issues? For example, how do we do planning better? And I think that's been, for me, has been a bit of my caution, is that those inward questions are being asked, but far less so than the outward issues.
Thanks for that, Stuart. Yeah, I think good to have the contrarian point of view and a word of caution around the issue of job reservation. What was interesting, looking at some of the commentary and the narrative, was that although it was the overwhelming issue in terms of numbers and mentions, particularly in, I think it was question 10, that looked specifically at an open-ended question and what is the issue and what would your message be to an organisation. There were a number that were very cautionary around the whole job reservation issue and saying, some of the work that we do as planners takes us into the world of finance, into the world of infrastructure planning. And if we are asking for job reservation as planners, what does that mean when we're transgressing on some of the other professions and their work more broadly? So there is two sides to this story, but make no mistake, the overwhelming response in the survey was very much in favour of this issue. I think it's important to re-emphasise that. From the next up, Priscilla, you'd like to come in on.
Yes, so just to the question about the report and its findings, to be honest, I think most of the results accurately reflected the positions of graduates and professionals in sort of identifying the fundamental concerns around planning organizations as well as planning practice itself. It was comforting to see that SACPLAN scored well in terms of communication during lockdown. However, in the same breath, I would agree with Cor's earlier point that it seems all our planning organizations seem to be operating in silos. I understand that each organization needs to maintain an individual identity, but there are things that we can learn from one another in terms of information sharing, engagement with members, etc. The most surprising finding for me was the question regarding the number of graduates or professionals. It recorded the number of graduates, professionals who have no intention of becoming members of any organization. Although the open-ended responses seem to give an indication of what troubles individuals have with joining various organizations, it almost begs the question of what more can be done by our organizations to better reach potential members. Maybe another question coming on from that is whether those troubles were resolved, e.g. job reservation. Would this then prompt individuals to join our organizations? So there's sort of that question as well.
Next up, Tsepo, you had wanted to come in. Really would like to hear your thoughts and your feedback.
As you know, embarking on job seeking and then coming across the sudden global health crisis during this year, I grew a sense of understanding of the current economic situation. However, after going through the report of the survey, I would like to point out that I did not realize that things were this bad in the fraternity until I engaged the report itself. I mean, the biggest issues highlighted were jobs and the availability of work by those in private practices. In my opinion, these two variables are creating an aura of desperation in the market and to get work by those practicing privately. And the talent and innovation in the planning fraternity to solve societal issues will get compromised going forward, and you'll get mediocrity results and the production of services completely deviating from the progressive normative stances advocated for in planning after 1994. And by natural selection, you'll get that the competitive intelligence in the profession it's lacking, and that it is likely to be invaded by other professions, as Fanus explained. If you talk of transformation in the society, and you comprehend that planners are probably the ones I know are the only trained professionals who can engage complex and multidisciplinary interventions to human development. And if it becomes obsolete, it will only exacerbate the issue of inequality in the society, and the public will not be protected in due course. If you talk to individuals in the fraternity, there is a sense of anger and tensions induced by lack of transformation, and more articulations are made on the question of the relevance of the planning bodies, particularly SAPI and SACPLAN.
important points that you're making there, Tsepo. Thanks for that. Nelly, from your side, some thoughts, some observations?
From my side, two things that surprised me in the outcome of the survey. One, it's a relatively small number compared to the petition, which is at 2,000 and over. So I think we need to look at it in that light. Secondly, it seemed to me that there was more response from the practicing planners, a little bit less from the students, and also less from the academic side of things. And it would be interesting to see what those sectors of the planning profession had to offer. But overall, for me, it does strike me that, and I wanted to comment about what we offer, what's the offering of the planning as a profession. And the fact that others are creeping into that context is because perhaps the visibility of the work that planners do is actually not evident. And therefore, anybody and everybody thinks that they can do planning work. I also do get a sense that we need to make a distinction from the survey on a regulatory body and a voluntary body. I think we are treating all of them as being the same, and they're not. The SACPLAN, for example, and I'm not talking about on their behalf, as I said, I'm here on personal capacity, but there is often a very clear role, and that's why the Act is there, as to what should a regulatory body like the Council of Planners do. And if that is not being addressed, then as a nation, there ought to be a call to see how that council is managed and regulated. And then there is the voluntary organizations, and I am a member of SAPI, for example. And one of the things that one benefits from those kinds of organizations is really about knowledge sharing, being able to showcase best practice. And I would like to see a context where we are navigating towards demonstrating to society, especially now, the importance of planning, what planners do differently, what planners do best, and what planners can do going forward. What are we offering to the policymakers, the decision makers that we're seeing currently? And there doesn't seem to be a robust conversation as to what planners actually do. I am concerned, for example, that the infrastructure department or the infrastructure unit has been set up. I don't really see a serious voice coming from the planning fraternity as how we engage with the built environment professions. Public Works has just put out a whole set of new projects that they're going to be considering as priority. Planners featuring there, I would really like to hear that voice coming through. And if we have all these forums and associations, at least there should be some amplification of those concerns.
This first round, we're going to conclude with Jessica. Jessica, your thoughts, maybe comments on what you've heard or something new from your side on the survey?
Yeah, it was really sad to see some of the responses. I found them a little bit depressing, but I mean, they were honest. And I think the real challenge has been, or the thing that has been killing these organizations from my side, what I see is that they haven't created this space that you're creating. They haven't allowed people to be able to have a space to raise issues, because, everything needs to be improved. Even the best things, systems need to be improved. And if an organization doesn't have that space for people to be able to add their voice to how they can improve things, such as what you're doing, then, they kind of die either a fast or slow death. So unfortunately, I think both of these organizations need to look into that. They are different, and I'll just talk to SAPI since SACPLAN has been covered, in that it's a regulatory body. At one point, they were joined. They were one thing back in the day. But yes, they needed to split, because you needed that activist arm and you needed that regulatory arm that serve different functions. And now, ideally, there should be activism and all these things that we're talking about. Ideally, it should be SAPI leading this, because SAPI is meant to be an organization that represents every sector. So, I mean, when I was chair for so many years as the Western Cape and then in the national, but back in that time, they were decentralized. Basically, I had all control of that region's decisions and so on. It wasn't that I had to be completely controlled by national. And as soon as it happened, it started to die out, in terms of, because it's just what, and I find that even SACPLAN could look at that. As soon as things become too centralized, it seems to hurt these kind of professions, even the regulatory. And that is something I think really needs to be looked at in terms of how to improve things going forward, and the kinds of comments or maybe ways we can look at improving things. I know SAPI is actually tackling that, and RIA has realized that that is a big thing that has happened that has not been good for the organization. I mean, they haven't yet done anything about it, but they're debating it. So hoping that we do get an activist arm back which properly represents activism. I mean, really what we need is what you're creating, Peter, and it's unfortunate that it's not been done already, actually. So thank you for doing this. One other, just in terms of the report, I guess I haven't commented on that. I think the thing that worried me a little bit is and I think question 6 was the diversity wasn't really as important as I thought it should be when it comes to the institutional makeup. Because personally, for me, that should be one of, if not, I'd say the second or third priority, because I understand job reservation is key. Yeah, diversity, it's ultimately, and when I say diversity, it's not just about the race or age or gender, it's also about youth, age, so I was going to say. And getting that diversity, which I don't see in any of the organizations, and I think that's another big gap. And why they're not operating maybe at the level they could be, because how are they truly representing the youth? I mean, are the youth actually part of that organization? Are they represented by an old professor? Because I don't call that representation, and that was when I was chair back then. I really tried to get the youth to run with this, because ideally voluntary and activist organizations, in my view, should be led by youth, with the older ones supporting it.
No, thanks, Jess. Again, appreciate that feedback. And it was a massive surprise to me. The diversity issue was quite a shock, actually, to see that was almost just inconsequential in a country which is trying to deal with transformation and diversity and recognizing it comes in all shapes, all forms, ages, races, backgrounds. That just didn't seem to be of importance was a real surprise and a real disappointment, to be honest, because it almost suggested that there was almost a real ambivalence to issues. But hey, I mean, this is what the survey was there for. People were able to, in an anonymous way, have their say, and it's interesting that was one of the least important issues. Question 3 was about the person who was responding and the work that they did. And the question that was being asked is, has there been a difference, recognizing that COVID-19 has certainly worsened the economic future of South Africa, coming on the back of an economic already technical recession that we're in. And so I had expected to see quite a stark response and difference between the public and private sector, and so it came to be. There was a very strong suggestion from the responses overall that more than 60% of the respondents said that things are worse. That was at least things are worse. That there are numbers of people who responded that they'd lost jobs. We've already heard Fanos talk about that being the trigger that led him to raise the petition. That people had managed up until this point, but they see that I will either lose my job or I'll have to let staff go. So 60% of respondents indicated that things were worse or worse than that. Interestingly, when we looked and filtered that on the public sector, that was very, very different. That there was a very strong response that things were almost no difference. The public sector employees, more than 60% said there had been no difference. Now, I suppose this is not surprising, in as much as salaries for the time being, as the municipalities are in, 3 or 4 months of their economic space, have not yet seen that. I suspect if we took this in a year's time, we would see that number change. But I was very interested to see that how stark a difference it was between the public and the private sector. Anybody got any thoughts on that? I think, Fanos, you had wanted to come in on that.
Yes, Pete, thank you. When it comes to that question where you see a great margin between the private and the public sector, what you have to understand, Pete, is that I work for a private sector, right? If we don't invoice in the private sector, you have to know that there's no income that will come through. And therefore, employers have nothing to do but to let the employees go, you understand? That is the same thing that question is also similar to the question 9 of your survey of how would you rate the value of money offered by the organization you are a member of. If you check there, the great margin of people who are saying that it's a waste of money are people who are working in the private sector, because the people in the private sector are the ones that are more affected by these issues. Thank you, Pete.
Thank you for that, Fanos. Appreciate that. And again, stark reminder of no invoice, no money. The ability to get those invoices generated and the work. Without that, you've got serious problems. From your side, Cor, you also wanted to come in on this issue?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I think that's almost just re-emphasizing the disconnect sometimes or often that exists between the private and the public sector, where we are in the private sector much more in tune, I think, with fluctuations in the market. And, if something politically happens, or like this pandemic now, or whatever, there's sometimes quite an acute swing in the market. People who would have accepted a job or a fee proposal last week would suddenly just shut down and say, I'm not making any decisions, I'm just holding tight or sitting tight. Or they argue about lower fees while your amount of work that you need to submit and prepare for council submission remains the same, and so on. So it's something that's been voiced also at our committee meetings, where there's almost a nonchalance, if you like, sometimes, not without sympathy, but maybe almost like a laid-back approach from, let's say, planners or local authorities or public sector workers, where they're not really affected. Like everyone's now mentioned, if you don't invoice, you don't get a salary at the end of the month. And it's a pity that disconnect often seem to go on, because the public sector planners, they have their jobs, they get their salary at the end of the month, whether there's a lot or little work to do. I don't think it's something that can actually be resolved, but it would be useful if a bigger empathy almost can be created in the public sector to assist us in the private sector when these things happen, like now with COVID. And like I said before, we are busy with, for instance, high-level discussions with the city to try and mitigate the impact and make it easier for everyone. But that's quite a significant thing that the survey told us, that the public service planners or respondents were actually saying there's just no difference to their lives, basically.
Not necessarily a surprise, but as I say, I think I get a sense that when this thing starts to bite on the rates, income, the service charges, etc., and starts to impact, public sector is not going to be immune from the impact of COVID and the technical recession. I'm very, very sure of that. But let's see. Talking of comparisons between then and now, Stuart, you did something a few years ago, 2017. You did quite a survey. Maybe some of your thoughts on what that survey showed, and perhaps the contrast with what you've seen in this 2020 version.
Our 2017 survey, we included some kind of question. We included questions such as, do you feel that your planning education prepared you for practice? Do you find your work as a planner fulfilling? And I think one of the tendencies we also noted in that survey was a general, the public sector planners were more positive towards the education preparing them for practice, for being more fulfilled, and so forth. Private sector planners tended to be a lot more negative on that. And that's not so much of a condemnation on the private sector. I think more that's a question of, there's an argument that potentially our professional organizations, our planning education is very public sector focused. And there is a question for me about how do we better represent, and in terms of organizations, but also from an academic side, how do we better prepare people for private sector planning? Because I think there might be a bit of a gap on that side. I think that's my comment on that.
Peter, one of the things that came up was the discussions that have been held between the South African Association of Consulting Planning Practitioners and SACPLAN, specifically on this issue of job reservation. Fanos has made it very clear that was one of the demands of the petition. There have been conversations. I think one of the things has been how that's been understood and communicated. Is that something with your SACPP hat that you can perhaps just give us a bit of background to what has been going on and how that's progressed? Is it something that would be looked at? Is it something that the respondents will have, quote unquote, good news on, or is it something that's still quite a way off?
Yeah, I'm able to respond. I've been actively involved in a number of discussions, not only from SACPLAN and the association, but also SACPLAN SAPI. And tomorrow, in fact, there's another discussion, SACPLAN and the what we call CHOPS. It's the organization of heads of planning schools, which is a separate entity. Those discussions are centering or focusing on the drafting of draft rules, not regulations, with a focus on identifying work categories to be reserved for planners, different categories of planners, as we've discussed. And the reason why it is focusing on rules, because SACPLAN is able to create rules and publish them and enforce them, is because the department, the then Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, and going back, Land Affairs, and now Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development, that is the custodian of the Planning Profession Act, the department in charge. And that department has not taken on board the proposal by SACPLAN to publish regulations to the Planning Profession Act. The minister who appoints SACPLAN is authorized to create regulations, which obviously would be stronger or more enforceable when compared to rules that SACPLAN would make under its legislation and authority. And that is the background. So the draft structuring of the rules for the identification of work for reservation for planners is the topic of discussion, after which the draft in writing will be made available to the larger profession via publications in the Government Gazette and on the website and so on for comment before it is then finally published for outside bodies like the land surveyors to respond to. So that's what's been ongoing in the last week or two.
Thanks very much for that feedback, Peter. I really appreciate that. Priscilla, maybe you want to come in. You're saying you'd like to add something? That'd be very welcome.
From SACPLAN's perspective, and just summarizing what they presented to us, and obviously they would be better positioned to speak for themselves, but unfortunately they're not here. But the message that we got from it is that there is some uncertainty in the Department of Land Reform and Agriculture. And so planning as a profession in that department has been lost to an extent, and they're not the priority there, resulting in them not getting traction for pushing the draft legislation for job reservation. So I think what they intended to do was to get a start by having these rules and converting them into regulations if there is a change in minister who would be willing to lend an ear, a listening ear. Just not in defending SACPLAN or anything, but just giving the message in terms of our understanding from what their position is. It's not that they don't want job reservation. I think they're also being blocked from their side as well. So sometimes they hear that job reservation or whatever legislation they've created is on the agenda. Sometimes they hear that it's not. And yeah, so in spite of all this, they're still pushing for these rules for the draft legislation for job reservation.
That's very helpful. Thanks for explaining that, Priscilla. I certainly get a sense that within the national ministries, the shunting around of planning, the lack of a real home, the lack of a planning ministry, whether it's one for cities or some such, is a massive challenge. And we're lost, we're rudderless in that political and administrative space nationally, I would argue. But yeah, I think appreciate that feedback. I'm coming now to Nelly. Nelly, we want to try and change the conversation up in this sort of last round of inputs of saying, we've heard about the survey, we've reflected on what the survey has told us and either surprised us or confirmed. But what is it we can do in terms of a call to action, in terms of saying, if there's one thing that we can do, what is it you think we should be doing more of, or start doing, or stop doing for that matter?
Yeah, thank you, Pete. And I think in terms of a call for action, I did mention about us seeking to find a way out of this that could help us move the needle. And when I talk about collaboration, it's really about how do we as a collective body of planners really make a stand for planning as a profession. As you say, there is no real home for planning at present, within the setup. So how do we, as these various organizations, consolidate our views together to ensure that planning takes its place where it deservedly should be? I mean, we sit in rural development and land reform and agriculture. Other built environment professions sit elsewhere. So how can we, through these conversations, really amplify the work that we do, how we do it, and how we are best at doing it in order to be able to claim that place? So I'm asking from the petitioners to the survey results and interested parties, if we can come up with an action proposition to the various departments to indicate this is who we are, this is what we do, and this is where we think we belong. And I think that could help elevate the position that we currently are finding ourselves in.
Well, let's continue the conversation. Mark, you perhaps had a slightly different thinking to it, different approach.
I think that we need to recognize the roles and almost specific niches that the various voluntary organizations fulfill and perform. I think we do collaborate on a number of issues. So SAPI and SAACPP last year jointly hosted a talk at the World Town Planning Day at the city of Cape Town. So things like that happen. I think there's a more fundamental issue here, and it's the issue that Peter Dakum raised earlier, and that is this divide between public and private planners. And Nelly, you mentioned yourself now as well. It's this thing of we are planners, and we need to establish ourselves and almost make our space. And for me, that involves that's about taking positions on some really serious issues and affecting our society today. And planners tend to be very quiet about this. So when it comes to collaboration, I think it's an issues-based thing where an organization like SAPI, in my mind, and hence I actually came along to it, should create the platform and the vehicle that says, guys, let's challenge the way we do things. Let's challenge authorities in a way that is not person specific, because there's always the politics of things. How do we take positions on things and draw people across the spectrum along those positions? Thanks, Pete.
Jessica, your thoughts on this in terms of a call to action about getting things going, moving in the right direction, actually seeing something happen as opposed to talk.
I agree with most of the points about a collective active voice. Something I always used to say when I used to be chair as well, that, and I'm going to refer to SAPI obviously because it is meant to be the organization that represents all sectors, and you're supposed to come there as a planner, not representing your sector. So it's a space where you're supposed to come and talk as a planner for planning cause without the baggage of, fighting between what's private, public, or academic. And there's a lot of different views, and there's a lot of infighting that goes in the sectors, which I think holds us back a lot in terms of trying to have one collective voice. I mean, I saw when the job reservation was first debated, it was just quite depressing to see how easily planners were just overridden by the other professions completely. Even in the debates, there was actually more people in the first debates from the other professions, especially land surveyors, than planners. And it just feels like we're not putting together, and it's always been a challenge, how we can work together more and just create this activist collective voice and group. And maybe through this, I know SAPI and working together, SAPI and SACPLAN, they do a similar thing, and often we have worked together. Certainly when it comes to job reservation, we say similar points. It's hard to come with a definite solution or recommendation on how to achieve this, because it's quite a difficult one, because you've got these bodies that are meant to be doing this, but not quite managing. And maybe what you're doing is how we're going to achieve it. Pete, maybe this is what we need, because if these other bodies aren't doing it, maybe this will shake them up. So hopefully the outcome of this will move us better to this collective action. I think that's all I can say.
Tsepo, your side, your thoughts on what do you think from the perspective of someone who is trying to kickstart that career?
Thank you, Pete. You'd remember when I submitted my paper to the South African Cities Network Young Designers Competition, I spoke a lot about planning losing its grip and many bottlenecks in the system that are making planning ineffective. And we are losing the mission towards human development, and we are supposed to be capacitating our resources to make sure that change happens. But besides diagnosing the problems, I've also proposed a lot of instigating steps to reclaim the attitude of developmentalism and progressive interventions in the planning fraternity. One of the key things I think we should be addressing, Pete, is changing our organizational culture in private practice and also the public office. We need to preach what we say in the normative frameworks in terms of how we do things. And that means we have to get rid of pessimism, and we must apply more competitive intelligence. And we need a planning that is more biting. And it means that the profession itself must be protected. It must be protected from invasion. Job reservation is a very important thing, considering that planning in the future might become obsolete. SACPLAN, for example, as it is constitutionally mandated to protect the public. If you don't protect planning, the planning profession, you are simply not protecting the public. I think one thing we can be doing, and in simple English, Pete, I would like to see planning being mentioned more on the news, for example, in the economic forums. And I certainly want to see a rejuvenated SAPI and SACPLAN and the role of planning in the fraternity as well.
Thanks for that. Again, very eloquent, very well put forward there, Tsepo. Thank you for that. Fanos, your thoughts. You certainly know all about action, about getting a call to action and getting things moving. You have a very, very strong social media presence. What's your take on this?
On this issue, what has been recently, after your report also brought back that, when the petition went off, people had that fire to say, let's bring change. So after your report after the survey, people reaching out to me to say, Fanos, let's take a next step forward. So the next step forward that people have been suggesting, planners, that have been suggesting on my side are that they are planning to do a national lockdown, a professional one, where people will drive to the freeway and probably just block the freeway, like driving 5 kilometers per hour. You understand? That they are saying that then the country will, let's say the department, they will know the importance of town planners. They will start recognizing town planners, because people are saying that the department is not taking planning profession as serious. That's why they're dragging this job reservation issue. So planners have suggested a national lockdown. And the other thing that planners have been suggesting that has been up, they say, what is the next action after the petition? So we've done a draft memorandum of demands that is going to be sent to the SACPLAN. SACPLAN is the reason SACPLAN keeps on coming up is because it's one body that is recognized nationally. Planners are saying they cannot submit application if they're not registered with SACPLAN. SACPLAN has the presence and it has the numbers, and it's already existing, so it can able to resolve these issues. In hand with also the recent organization that you brought into our attention, your SAGC, your UDISA, your SAACPP, which I was very impressed with the results from the SAACPP. I'm even considering to join them. People are so happy with the fees that they are paying. They are happy with the response from the organization itself. They are happy with the communication, So the next step from here is the memorandum of demands together with the national lockdown, so that the departments, they understand and they know that they are town planners and town planners are not happy. Thank you, Pete.
Okay, so you're going for a very direct and very immediate response there. I say, and a lockdown, that would be a new one for the planning profession. Cord, did you want to respond to the proposition from Fanos?
We, as private planners, you always think of the next hour and what you can do in that, because time is so precious. And I'm just concerned that a national lockdown would firstly remove quite a lot of time out of one's busy day already for which you cannot invoice, which is the one thing, thereby reducing income for people even further. And like all lockdowns, if not everyone is part of it, then you almost don't get the same results that you were wanting to. So it's almost like everyone or no one. Otherwise, it's a few lost souls protesting outside Parliament or whatever. But then the other side of that coin is also it's difficult to sell a national lockdown and losing some hours to a client that's very anxious about getting done and applications submitted or whatever the case is. So they might not always share our passion for a lockdown in trying to further our own interests. That's just the point that I wanted to bring across. Yeah, I think there's so many protests going on currently as well. One must be careful that you don't get lost in a national lockdown and people don't even notice you because there's so much happening around you, protests and so on. So that's I don't think it will always have the results that we would hope it would have. That's just my point.
No, again, I think a counterpoint is always valuable. So thank you for that, Cor. Stuart, yes. You had wanted to give some sort of reflection and thinking in the whole question of ethics and the whole question of the way that we hold ourselves. Some thoughts from your side?
Definitely. Just before I do that, I just want to emphasize something again, is we keep on talking about job reservation as if SACPLAN pushes it, it will happen. We've got to realize that the Competition Commission, when they received applications from the Built Environment Council, has refused the exemption for job reservation legislation for the professional bodies, both in 2012 and in 2019. So I also want to come back before I get to that, just on the earlier point about saying we potentially are digging a little bit of a hole in that we're pushing for something which might not be possible legally. And I agree, it is partly an issue of national government, but there's also quite a strong legal issue as to whether it will actually be allowed in terms of competition legislation. Just the point I wanted to make was about the need to create a sense of empowerment. I think from your survey and from the work I've done, I'm very much picking up the sense that planners are feeling we can't do our work. And the response has been we need to have legislation to protect us, to say that we can do our work. And I think the earlier conversation about that value proposition, I think there's a stronger conversation about empowering planners to feel that they've got something to offer, but also a need for a critical reflection to say is we have something to offer, but we need to do things differently. So an ability to look inside and say, how do we do things differently? But it starts from a place of realizing planning has something to offer. As an earlier point, how do we market that? How do we get people, show people we have something to offer? And I think for me, part of it also is really comes down to land use management. Can we show people that we can produce good regulations? Can we show people that we produce something that is unique to planning that other professions don't have? And I think the one analogy I always come back to is you don't go to an architect to draw up a building plan because the architect has job reservation. You go to an architect to draw up a building plan because an architect is the profession to do that. So for me, that question of empowerment is also getting people to start saying we have something of offer and to offer that product of value so that we get recognized on the quality of our work, not because people are forced to do it because of legislation.
Stuart, again, thank you. Thanks for that sobering reminder. Just an observation from my side, and having interviewed 2 weeks ago the Royal Town Planning Institute president for the year, Sue Mans, I was really struck, and if you haven't listened to that episode, I would really strongly encourage you to do so, because a lot of the pace and the content, the enthusiastic outlook, even in the toughest of times, and recognizing that the UK, much stronger economy, but really struggling with all sorts of its own issues, and the COVID has really hit hard there. To hear their value proposition, to hear their campaign, and this sense that they are value adding, engaging with government at national level in a fairly direct way, and very clear that they have a value proposition. I think that is the one thing that we are missing in this conversation of and I think Stuart's alluded to it, which is what is our proposition as a collective, not as a collective as a municipal official or a client who is providing a service, a professional who's providing a service to a client. But what is it as we as the profession are up for? What is it why would people take us seriously right now? What is it that we are offering in terms of a genuine future whereby we are helping shape that? If I think as something, the biggest shock to me from the survey was that 9 out of 10 of the respondents had not got involved or engaged in any shape or form with the organizations that we mentioned. So there's an apathy there. There's an immediate apathy in terms of, well, if I can't even be bothered to be part of the organization, whether it's voluntary or regulatory, then it's a massive problem. The question of, how do we define a role for ourselves? If we can't do it now during COVID, we never will. That's almost my proposition. We've been trying since 1994 to frame a proposition that seeks to address the fragmentation of our inherited apartheid legacy that we've been dealing with. Yet we still don't seem to be able to frame that proposition in a meaningful way that people take us seriously. That's my own. It's very rare that I will put forward a proposition or a viewpoint like this, because that's not my job as the podcast host. But it is something I feel strongly about, and it's something that I'm using this opportunity. I'm not sure if anyone would agree or disagree or would like to respond to that.
I completely agree that we can't be. We must be bringing something to the table. I think that part of the reason that we are not moving forward as a profession is that we've lost exactly that thing that makes us valuable to society, or that shows that we're offering value to society. And I agree completely with what you said now, as well as what Stuart mentioned earlier. I do think there's another element to it, which is that issue of ethics, code of conduct, and I say it from the perspective of planners having to work in organizations where decisions aren't always made on planning merit. It may be that decisions and planning decisions are made for political reasons. And to my mind, I always thought that there's an additional element apart from what we do, how we do it. Also, that element of having that set of principles that we can subscribe to and that we can be held accountable to, so that when we start making decisions and recommendations that is perhaps more informed by the politics of things, that we can be taken on and challenged, because I think we're not doing enough of that, and we're not doing enough of asking ourselves, how do we do better? Thanks, Pete.
No, thank you, Mark. Appreciate that. Thank you for responding to the proposition and the provocation. The whole question of how we can gain momentum, Nelly, you were asking, how do we take it forward? I think needs some more thoughts. I think it'll be interesting to see if we get any feedback to this episode. I think it'll be important to see. We rarely get feedback on episodes. I'm going to be very interested, and particularly Fanos, using your social media network there to see if we can get a deeper reach on this episode and see what people say. Do they agree? Do they disagree? I think the survey has spoken volumes. I think the petition has put a particular perspective out. And again, if you haven't listened, or if you haven't rather read the survey report, if you've got 10 minutes over a cup of coffee, have a look at it to the listener out there.
The point that was put through by Pete, when we spoke about the national lockdown, he brought some insight that I was not thinking of. The podcast itself, it helped me to also view certain points in a certain way. And the question that you asked throughout when we were about to close, of what are we bringing to the table? What are we going to do to give back to the community itself? It also raised a lot of questions that we need to address.
I also think that it's this sort of forum that we need to get going more often, man. Because it's that coffee, having coffee together and discussing the issues. And it's I think the fantastic thing about COVID, for me at least, has taught me that you don't have to be physically sitting next to somebody to have a conversation with that somebody. And in this sort of forum, which I think makes life easier for a lot of us who are very busy, and family life and everything else. So I think these sort of things are opportunities. From an organizational perspective, I think it's still too old school. So the idea of social media where you can quickly start discussing things, I think that is the way to go. And organizations need to create those spaces for members to come up and interact without having to formally go to a meeting, go sit in an AGM and so forth. Because I don't think that's the way of doing things anymore. I think people forget that things don't get done at committee level. It's stepping up, especially on the voluntary organization side. It's stepping up and saying, guys, I can do this component of it. And it's a once-off touch base. Do your bit of thing and bug off again, And again, a lot of those things revolve around topics that you feel passionate about. But again, I think there's responsibility on the organizations to say, guys, here's the platform. We need help here. Touch base. Come to us.
Things that I'm hearing the young planners, saying is this lack of exposure and, being able to have a hands-on experience on things. And I do think that just even showcasing some of the work that the planning people are doing would really, really be a value add for young planners to see how things are done and what can be done better. And, even just, peer reviews or even having, annual, not even competitions, annual just awards of excellence, for example. How do we then engage with each other? And those don't need to have conferences and stuff. We can do those through small webinars or podcasts and the like. So I really want to thank the petitioners who started this to get the conversation going. And I support the view of having a collective position, to get stand together as a profession as opposed to different entities. And I think that's what planning was in 1995. And I'd hoped by 2020 that we would have a one planning fraternity in South Africa that speaks towards, if not anything, integration. And let's not lose the crisis. I mean, COVID is a silver lining is to help us, actually come out of this better. So that's my parting shot, that let's not waste a crisis.
I don't know if it's similar with the other organizations, but you find that a lot of members only show up for these AGMs, I suppose certain socials that the organizations host. You hardly see them or hear from them throughout when certain legislation is passed or whether some legislation requires comment. So I think Mark has raised a really good point about how to engage our members a lot better, obviously through using social media, and then per Pete's suggestion as well, just by hosting webinars. And it doesn't have to be long. It could be 45 minutes to an hour. Just keep it to one topic and just get people talking.
From my side, I want to thank you, each of you, very much for giving 90 minutes of your time. It's very clear that when I talk about apathy and a problem in the industry, it's not the people that are engaged here this evening, and it's probably not the people who are listening to this podcast. To Jessica, to Stuart, to Fanos, to Tsepo, to Mark, Nelly, Peter, Kor, and Priscilla, I really want to thank you for your time and effort. I do think what might be worth considering is, once we've got some feedback from the episode, once we've had a chance to think and play back the conversation to ourselves, about potentially coming back in 2 or 3 months and seeing if we can't come with a very strong proposition of what we've either heard, the continued engagement with the National Department, with SACPLAN, etc., Peter, but really come together again as this group and say, is this something we can have a more regular conversation? Maybe it's a quarterly bulletin that we can put out. We can bring in people, we can invite people into this space. The podcast has never been about just one voice. It's always been about a diversity of voices. And I think tonight, we've, for the first time in the year that the podcast has been going, we've started to see a diversity of opinions, contrasting viewpoints, contrasting action points. And so, let's look at that and think about how we can broaden this to a much broader audience, and whether it's a live webinar or some such next time around. With that, colleagues, I want to thank you for your time. All the very best, and stay safe. Stay you and your families. Thank you for your time this evening. All the very best.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.